All right, false.
Okay.
So that one's false, but don't believe me. Just read George Conway's tweets. We got Chris Matthews here. I'm going to jump over all the good morning at that. Chris, so when Donald Trump was standing in front of the line of cars, and he was like, "Hey, you're going to," he's giving his spiel. He reminded me of Robert Duvall in The Godfather 2 from the back of the room after Michael Corleone had gotten off the perjury charges, saying, "You owe my client an apology to the." I mean, not exactly how you would expect Donald Trump to respond to the news as it broke.
Every time we watch a criminal case, we get a verdict. The guy who got off says, "I'm innocent. I've been proven innocent." Actually, he's been acquitted. He has been proven innocent. But they all do that. I'll just tell you, I study like you. I know politics, Joe. And I watched this Friday night when we got the word at 5 o'clock. I thought it was very strange to get a close of business Friday, which has always been the dumping ground for news. You hide this stuff in the old days because you didn't have 24/7 news coverage.
Right.
And you could hide it from the columnists who write their columns on Thursday, and you could kill them in the Sunday papers by sneaking it out late Friday. So I thought that was a little sneaky. But then I saw the news. No, it was Sherlock Holmes. Deduction. The dog that didn't bark. Hound of the Baskervilles. No indictments of any of his associates or family members or henchmen for collusion, for conspiracy to support the Russian intervention in our campaigns. And when I heard that, none of the kids, none of the henchmen, not even Roger Stone, none of them, Gates, none of them, Manafort, nobody involved. I go, wait a minute. There's not going to be even a hidden charge somewhere in here against the president. There's not even going to be a statement about him. So they didn't have him on collusion. And that to me means there will not be a conviction in the U.S. Senate this year. That's not going to happen. I doubt that there's going to be, I know that if there's a majority vote in the House for impeachment, it'll be almost entirely Democrats. And you can make a case for obstruction of justice. I made it on the air. But it's all broad daylight behavior by the president, firing Comey. All that stuff we watched was a good case for obstruction of justice. But the Republicans already know that stuff, and they're not voting for it. They're not supporting impeachment. So I think the Democrats have got to win the election.
What?
They got to win the election.
Oh, they gotta. I thought you said
they got to win the election. There's no waiting around for Uncle Robert to take care of them. And Uncle Robert did what he thought was right, and Barr did what he thought was right with his judgment call. You got to do your own case, and you got to look. We watched Nixon go down on evidence.
Right.
The June 23rd tape, where he was clearly involved in obstruction, in fact, leading the case for covering it up. We saw the Clinton stuff. We saw how he lied under oath. We had him. And we looked at the evidence. We looked at the facts. And right now, there's no case for his removal on collusion. And then we're going to argue about obstruction of justice for a while. But there again, it's a judgment call. And Barr made his judgment over the weekend. The Republicans are going to make their judgment. Yes, yes. Yes, but we're not removing him from office. So everybody's going to be partisan on this. Let's face it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The question, Chris, is that of course, maybe historians will be sorting through, is if there's no collusion, if there was no improper conduct.
There may have been that.
If Donald Trump had nothing to worry about all along, why did the president lie about his contacts with Russia during the campaign repeatedly? Why did the vice president lie about their contacts with Russia in January of 2017? Why did the attorney general lie in front of the United States Senate about his contacts? I mean, we could go.
Some people are just liars.
We can go down.
First of all, I'll tell you, it's not just all. Why do they all tell the same lie?
And that's the thing. They weren't.
Okay.
Hold on a second. One didn't lie about talking to Russians, and the other didn't lie about talking to Venezuelans, and another didn't talk about talking to Chinese. They all lied.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
About
I agree.
Talking to Russians.
People behave the way they behave, and they don't like being investigated.
About the same topic.
I know. Why did Saddam Hussein claim that he had all these weapons? And then go hide in a spider hole?
Because he
didn't have the weapons.
Because he was more afraid of the Shia than he was of the United States. I can explain that a lot better than I can explain this, which is why would you continue lying about your contacts with Russia?
Well, 2 years of looking into it, and they can't get it. And here's what. I agree with you about all that. First of all, I think there's a lot of prima facie evidence that there was back and forth dealings. A lot of meetings. All those meetings in the cigar bar at the Trump Tower, Kislyak meetings, all the meetings with
Well, how
Klimnik.
about the meeting on Air Force One where Donald Trump has everybody around and say, okay, this is how we're going to lie about our meeting with the Russians?
Well, so get yourself a job as special counsel.
No,
because in the end,
there is more of that onion to unpeel.
Well, okay, you can make that argument, but it was resolved this weekend politically.
Yes, it was.
But we haven't seen the report yet, and there are parts of the report that say the president was not exonerated. Joining us, along with senior White House reporter for Politico, specializing in legal and national security issues, Josh Gerstein, and also joining us as well, former CIA Director John Brennan, senior national security and intelligence analyst for NBC News. Let's start with Director Brennan. What is your biggest question this morning pertaining to the Mueller report, and especially the one line that was quoted by Robert Mueller, and that this does not exonerate him on the issue of obstruction?
Well, good morning, Mika. I think, like virtually everyone else, I believe strongly that as much of the Mueller report as possible should be released to Congress and to the American public. William Barr's letter summarizes that report and shapes perceptions of it with some tantalizing nuggets in that memo. But I do think that it raises a number of questions. And so on the first issue of interference in the U.S. election, Russian interference, I accept Bob Mueller's determination that despite the public call by Donald Trump for the Russians to go after Hillary Clinton's emails, and meetings at Trump Tower by Don Jr. Looking for dirt on Hillary Clinton, and the reference that Chris made to all of the other meetings that were taking place, I accept that he was not able to establish after this investigation that there was a criminal conspiracy or criminal coordination with the Russians in the interference of the election. I think that we should be relieved that there was not this active conspiracy going on between U.S. persons. Doesn't mean that they didn't do wrong things, they didn't do unethical or unprincipled things, but it did not meet that threshold of criminal conspiracy. But on the issue of obstruction of justice, I think that really is an open question. As William Barr's memo references, Bob Mueller said that there is evidence on both sides, and we need to have a better understanding of exactly what is underlying that statement. So I do think that Congress and American people deserve to have better insight into this issue.
Trying to understand the Attorney General's interpretation, he writes in this 4-page summary that the special counsel did not find that any U.S. person or Trump campaign official or associate conspired or knowingly coordinated in Russia's efforts to influence the 2016 presidential election. Is the word knowingly important there?
Well, I think, as we've talked before, people do some things unwittingly, and there clearly was an effort by Russia to try to engage in a criminal conspiracy by making offers to support the election prospects of Donald Trump. I'm glad that there was nobody who was actively abetting that, at least according to Bob Mueller's investigation. But clearly there were things that were going on that raised deep suspicions about whether or not American persons were actively working, again, wittingly or unwittingly, with the Russians. But Bob Mueller says no.
Josh, the special counsel's report does have this line in it, Barr's interpretation of it, where he quotes the special counsel saying it does not exonerate him. I'm wondering, there are a lot of questions this morning as to whether or not Barr's interpretation can be trusted. But Rod Rosenstein was involved with this. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to believe that he is working within the parameters of the law.
Yeah, I mean, I was down at the Justice Department all day yesterday as they were getting ready to send this information over to Congress. And it was very clear that Barr was trying to hug Rosenstein in this letter because he's saying these are decisions that we made jointly and assessments that we made jointly. But a lot of them are highly technical. I mean, some of the things you and Joe have talked about this morning, I mean, the fact that the president did many of these acts that some consider potential obstruction in public. They said that was a factor that leaned against charging them as obstruction. The fact that they didn't find an underlying conspiracy on the overall issue of whether there was collusion with the Russians is another thing. Why would somebody commit a cover-up if they didn't actually commit the crime? So they went through all these factors, and Some of it is highly technical, like, for example, the Barr and Rosenstein say that because the law here, the underlying law on obstruction says that there has to be an ongoing proceeding, and most people think, well, that means obstructing an FBI investigation is illegal. If you read the technicalities in this letter, it says obstructing an FBI investigation is not illegal, only obstructing a grand jury investigation. And did Trump know at each stage that there was an ongoing grand jury investigation? Those grounds are enough to excuse him, according to this Barr letter, which is pretty technical and hard to argue up on the Hill as opposed to in a court of law.
Right.
Mika, I have a question for Director Brennan.
Please.
Mr. Brennan, over the past year, you have said publicly that you believe President Trump's conduct approaches the level of treason. Do you still believe that based on the Attorney General's letter?
What I said was that his performance in Helsinki was
Correct.
nothing short of treasonous. I wasn't using it in a legal term. I was using it in sense of what he was doing with Mr. Putin, as far as having a 2-hour one-on-one meeting with him without his advisors present, as well as his giving Vladimir Putin a pass during that conference, that basically saying the Russians did not interfere in the election. I found that was flouting and trampling upon the determinations and assessments of the intelligence community that were unanimous. So I still believe that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. The question about why he has lied so much and so often. I do think that Donald Trump, is concerned that opening up an investigation on criminal conspiracy about working with the Russians would open up a Pandora's box of other types of things that could implicate him. And I think the referrals by Bob Mueller to Southern District of New York and other places demonstrate that there are still a lot of investigative threads that could implicate Mr. Trump.
Chris, on politics, I don't disagree with you. Democrats have to walk and chew gum. But I talked to a Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee who said that the fog of indecision around obstruction actually strengthens their ability to take a look at the obstruction report, if nothing else. How do you think that goes, and what sort of cautions would you have for them as they embark on that?
Yeah, I keep watching, like always, we watch Pelosi. She's the best. I've never seen anyone at corralling members like in either party. I mean, she gets 100% turnout. My old boss couldn't do that. It's an unusual Machiavellian power she has to be feared but not hated. That's the trick. Be feared but not hated. And I watched her, and I watched Natalie the other day on I guess, Meet the Press, and I watched him very carefully talk as if she's watching. And I think the message from her is, don't blow this the way the Republicans blew Clinton. Don't do that. Don't get out there looking like you're using the methodology of impeachment for partisan gain. Don't get caught doing that. And the way the scorecard on that works is it's unfair. If Republicans don't support impeachment, it's partisan, by definition. So if they hold tight with their 88%, with their grassroots. I was out on Fifth Avenue up in New York the other day on Saturday.
People jumping out of windows.
Crazy. The demonstrators all along Fifth Avenue are unbelievable. And they were on the end of political correctness. That one guy saw me. I guess this guy liked me, even though he's on the other side politically, I guess. And they were all there yelling, having the time of their life. They won. I think the Democrats in the suburbs. Now, just remember, Ocasio-Cortez is a political star. And a lot of those people on the left are stars. There's no doubt about it, for media coverage and excitement. But the Democrats won the 2018 election in the burbs with moderate candidates. And those people have to run again and again in those swing districts.
And they
have to
do
be careful.
not want to talk about Russia and Mueller in the suburbs in Virginia, the suburbs of Philly. It is bread and butter issues. And
save Social Security, save Medicare, and don't go socialist. That's the message out west. Save Obamacare. Don't go into this Medicare for all, because that'll screw up all their lives.
Chris, you brought up the Clinton.
By the way, who gets taxed when we raise taxes? The guy making $150 and his wife total, and paying a lot of taxes and paying for college. And that guy and that woman knows when you say socialism, you're thinking about them.
Isn't it something, Chris? You brought up the Clinton impeachment, and isn't it something we both, in our own ways, went through that? And people would always come back and they would be breathless.
Right.
I remember Lindsey Graham going over looking at evidence and saying he was in a purple rage and that he talking about Bill Clinton. He looked horrible. This is the end of him. I heard it was the end of Bill Clinton 1,000 times. And Mika will tell you throughout this entire process, I said to her all along when somebody would go, they're going to get Trump. I go, no. There's a replay.
That's true, he did.
There's a replay of Clinton.
I mean,
it always seems a lot easier than it is. They're not going to get him. There are so many parallels, except you just change the parties.
Yeah.
Self-propelled belief. Basically,
Self-propelled belief by the Republicans.
By the way, on the ethical stuff and the sexual stuff, which everybody is two-faced about, everybody, you get the Democrats out there, lay off the guy, move on, moveon.org, get rid of, don't talk about the sex anymore. And then it's all about the payoffs to the women. I mean, you know, the people have flipped 180 on every argument. You know, it's
Josh.
But you were tough on Clinton. I was tough on Clinton. I think I've been consistent about this, but I do think in the evidence, our job is news first, analysis second, and opinion third. All three of them are our jobs. And if you don't do them, you don't have a job. Because people want your opinion. But the first thing they want is the news. And the news is Trump won this weekend.
That is the news, Mike Barnicle.
He won this weekend.
Well, hold on a second. He won the news cycle. He won the PR battle. He won the branding exercise. We don't know what's in this report.
Okay, but
we don't know what's in this report.
But hold on a second. Mike Barnicle.
Absolutely.
Mike Barnicle, look at that headline.
Yeah.
I would argue that he not only won this week.
The Washington Post. The Dallas paper.
The Dallas Morning News report no collusion. And for Donald Trump, that's not about this news cycle. That's not about his speech this week. That is his closing argument in 2020. The Democrats tried to come after me because I'm a disruptor. The press lied about me because I'm a disruptor. I'm not in their little clubs.
It's a witch hunt.
They put, what are the numbers? 500, 2,000 subpoenas.
Well, it's a long report to...
Well,
I'm saying, look, 2020 is a long way away. This is a moment politically for a Democrat running for president to step up and talk to their party and mount a new argument in a post-Barr letter world. The Speaker Pelosi is the strategist, but who in this field, they're going around Iowa and New Hampshire, who's going to have a national message of how to take on President Trump in this new dynamic?
Right,
and that's
there,
the question.
They've got to be able to do both.
Mike Barnicle.
Well, I think the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, already indicated he has a national message, Robert, on that. But I mean, that headline, you know, I agree with John Brennan. That headline is kind of a lot of people won't want to hear this, but it's kind of good news for the country because basically it says the president of the United States is not guilty of treason. That's always a good thing.
That's good. That's a good day.
Said yesterday.
But Josh, let me ask you with regard to the rest of the report, and we only have fragments of it. So in essence, we're all flying blind on what Attorney General Barr is talking about. But one of the elements in the lack of a specific charge of obstruction in the report, that, and again, we don't know what would lead up to Bob Mueller's description of why they didn't want to go forward with obstruction. How important do you think it was, in terms of reasoning, what he came to, was the fact that there was no sworn sit-down testimony as to state of mind by the President of the United States with Mueller and his investigators?
Well, Mike, I mean, I think that was important, and it's hard to see how you could make a case with that without that kind of information. On the other hand, it seems like that was never going to happen, and it doesn't happen in most cases. I mean, the president, there was a lot of talk about different issues he could raise to block that kind of testimony, but he always could have taken the Fifth Amendment. And people say, oh, that's politically impossible. Well, about 20 things that are politically impossible have happened in the last 3 or 4 years. And so I think part of what's happened here with Barr is that he's taken out a kind of a balloon mortgage for the administration, right? He's come out with the top line findings that are obviously good news for the White House and are producing the kinds of headlines that we're showing, which are still almost 2 years away from the election. But the bill will come due. The rest of Mueller's evidence will come out. And even Barr acknowledged in that letter that there is substantial evidence on both sides, especially on the obstruction issues, with respect to each alleged action that the president took that was obstruction. So there will be another chapter to this story. Now, whether that's in 30 days,
when we
60
actually
days,
see the report.
90 days.
But that is such a good point. And for Barr to have squandered political capital on this, where he already had a dent in the bodywork on obstruction. He was already doubted about whether or not he could be a neutral arbiter of the obstruction case because of the memo he'd written unsolicited. He now took on more water, and Trump might need him to have more credibility and to have credibility among. I mean, it's Trump. You know, he's an unindicted co-conspirator in New York. There are 17 investigations into him. His attorney general just lost his credibility among, I would guess, all Democrats. And maybe even some Republicans are like, wow, Trump did get a Joe DiGenova light in Barr. Trump got his Roy Cohn. Trump got his Roy Cohn.
Yeah.
I don't know. So Barr might need his credibility back. Rosenstein was a witness in the I don't know what Rosenstein was doing, advising on whether or not to categorize the obstruction case as criminal or not. Rosenstein was the guy who was so strung out he wanted to wear a wire to catch Trump as a Russian agent. So I don't know what those. You couldn't find two more damaged arbiters of the Mueller case, which was really in a lockbox. We trusted it until Barr got his muddy fingers on it and Rosenstein weighed in. And they might wish they had their credibility back.
Well, we sure have a preview of the 4 o'clock show today.
Yeah, I know, that's a pretty good preview.
I know where she's going.
Now,
Imagine being Bill Clinton right now because of what you just said. He said no president's going to testify under oath. He's not going to let them look for a perjury trap or set one. Here's Clinton. He goes in before a grand jury on tape. We all watched this humiliation he had to go through, and he got in trouble by doing it. Bob Bennett, his lawyer, had him do it. Was Bob Bennett wrong? Should he have said, Mr. President, Bill Clinton, take the fifth, you'll have no problem? You'll never be impeached if you just take the fifth.
I think it was a different time, but you know,
I think it's actually why we're here
history,
today.
and that's the lesson they learned from that.
And we have a president now that if he takes the fifth, it doesn't hurt his image.
I can
Totally agree.
It
I can
could
tell you
build his
this.
image a little bit.
I can tell you this. I was surprised by the Republicans who actually did not like the fact that we made the President of the United States sit.
Yeah.
And he sat there and he answered questions. And I would argue that it helped him in the end, even though there was a charge. And it made us look like we were on a witch hunt. And it's probably why he left office with a 60% approval rating.
He got impeached in the history books.
And ended up a very popular president.
His wife had a mutual destruction pact with.
All right. Let's stay
They could not
focused.
talk about women's sex.
Director Brennan, I'm just curious, Mr. Director. How surprised were you by the findings yesterday, by the conclusions that were drawn? And I'm just curious, did you receive bad information throughout this process, like so many of us did, that there was more there than ended up in the report regarding collusion?
Well, I don't know if I received bad information, but I think I suspected that there was more than there actually was. And I am relieved that it's been determined that there was not a criminal conspiracy with the Russian government over our election. I think that is good news for the country. And so I still point to things that were done publicly or efforts to try to have conversations with the Russians that were inappropriate. But I'm not all that surprised that the high bar of criminal conspiracy was not met. I am surprised at that second part of obstruction of justice in terms of how it came out. I don't know whether or not Bob Mueller wanted the Attorney General to pronounce on that issue, or whether or not Bob Mueller felt that it would be best for Congress and American people to determine whether the weight of the information indicates that Donald Trump did try to obstruct justice. So there are some surprises there, and that's why I think getting to the full Mueller report is the best way to get some of these, if not all of these questions answered.
All right, former CIA Director John Brennan, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. Politico's Josh Gerstein, thank you too.
Josh.
It's great to have you here. Nicole Wallace.
We'll be watching.
We know what we're going to see
Deadline.
at 4 o'clock at Deadline.
We're moving on to
Wheat
Diddy's
House.
collusion.
His muddy hands.
No, but look, it's over.
But
Honestly,
hold on a
the
second.
collusion question is over. It's been asked and answered.
Yes.
Asked and answered on
Democrats should move on.
But the whole Justice Department could have moved on. They could have moved on by just letting Mueller's judgment stand. Instead, they could have sent that to Congress.
But you know, though, Robert Mueller could have also
he could have cleared him.
He very easily could have said that this is a question for Congress and the American people to
Maybe.
determine.
And as you're saying,
We don't know.
Maybe he did.
We've
This
got like
is-
3 partial quotes from his report.
Right, but this is a time where everything is unprecedented. You could have just taken Mueller's work, which no one had attacked, and handed it to Congress. Here, it's like a half-made dinner that you bring over. Like, oh, I didn't finish the salad. We've got to put the dressing. Just hand it off.
Do you know why you didn't do that?
No.
You've got to be careful talking about sources because some sources have been wrong throughout this entire process. But two sources I talked to, and one of the two sources, a Trump supporter, said there's highly embarrassing information in there, highly embarrassing political information in there for Donald Trump. So they don't want to release it. They want to keep as much of it out as humanly possible.
And they shouldn't have done what they did because now they almost guarantee that the obstruction.
I agree. One thing everybody agreed on, it wasn't fair of Comey to lash away at Hillary, even though he didn't prosecute. I think prosecutors should say guilty or not, and then shut up.
Right.
I think either you prosecute or you don't. And the idea of saying, well, there's Mets on this thing, and he's sort of guilty too, but I don't have the guts to prosecute him, but he's sort of guilty too. He left the door open for a bar. I think he should have said, offer in.
Yeah.
Okay, Chris Matthews,
Or
stay
in or
with
off.
us. Stay with us if you can. Still ahead on Morning Joe, an image from back in 1989 when a past president met a future one. Earlier this month, Michael Beschloss tweeted that picture of Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. Michael joins us along with Tom Brokaw on the differences and similarities to the investigations of the 37th and 45th presidents. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Although we did not find clear evidence that Secretary Clinton or her colleagues intended to violate laws governing the handling of classified information, there is evidence that they were extremely careless in their handling of very sensitive, highly classified information.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.